My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 33 years old. At the will reading for my grandfather's estate, my father slid a document across the conference table, placed my grandfather's blue fountain pen in my hand, and said with a smirk I had been watching since I was 16, "Sign it. You get nothing anyway." What he did not know was that 9 days earlier, I had already filed a petition with the Franklin County Probate Court to authenticate the original will. Welcome back to Raw Drama Stories, where the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who already called the court. I am an estate paralegal. I work for a firm called Whitmore and Hale in Columbus, Ohio, on the 3rd floor of a building that smells like copy paper and old coffee, and whatever candle the receptionist burns on Fridays. I have been doing this work for 8 years. Before that, I was a pre-law student at Ohio State on a partial scholarship I applied for myself because my father thought college was something other people's daughters did. What I do in practical terms is this: I read documents. Not the way most people read documents, skimming the important parts, trusting the headings, initialing where the tabs say to initial. I read the way a person reads when they know that the distance between what a document says and what someone is telling you it says can be worth 6 figures and the rest of your life. I have caught forged notary stamps. I have caught dates that don't match. I have caught signature pages that were lifted from one document and attached to another. I have caught codicils, amendments to wills that were backdated by 3 years. The people who do these things count on the grief of the beneficiaries to blur their reading. They count on people being too sad or too trusting or too tired to notice the small things that give everything away. They do not count on the beneficiary being me. My grandfather, Raymond Callahan, died in September. He was 84. He lived in a house on 4 acres in Hocking Hills with a lake out back that he called the pond, even though it was clearly a lake, and he spent the last years of his life reading Louis L. Amer novels on the porch and feeding bread to ducks he had named individually and never explained. He was the only person in my family who ever asked me what I was working on and then actually listened to the answer. When he gave me his fountain pen at my law school graduation, a blue Montblanc that had belonged to his own father, he pressed it into my hands with both of his and said, "You're the first one. Don't let that be the last thing you are." I didn't know what he meant exactly. I do now. The invitation to the will reading came from my father, a text, not a call. "Reading at Whitmore and Halla Thursday, 2 p.m. Be there." I noticed he'd misspelled the firm's name. I did not correct him. I have been paying for things in this family since I was 16 years old, not in the way that teenagers chip in for groceries once in a while. In the way that a 16-year-old with a job at a Kroger on Morse Road becomes, without any formal meeting or discussion, the person responsible for keeping the lights on. The first time, I was 16 and a half. The electric bill was past due. Pink notice on the kitchen counter. My father was between jobs, which in our house meant he was watching television, and my mother was covering for him to everyone outside the house. The bill was $187. I had $210 in a savings account I'd opened myself at a Key Bank branch because a teacher told me to. I paid it. Nobody thanked me. My mother made pot roast that night like nothing had happened. My father ate 2 plates. That was the template. That was how it worked for the next 17 years. When I was 19 and in my first semester at Ohio State, I sent $300 home because my sister Diane had overdrawn the checking account and the car payment was coming. Diane was 24 at the time. She worked at a salon in Westerville and spent most of her earnings on things she photographed for social media. My father called me and explained the situation in a tone that suggested I was the one who had done something wrong by not already knowing. When I was 24, fresh out of my paralegal certification program and making $38,000 a year, I co-signed a lease on my parents' apartment in Gahanna because my father's credit score made him ineligible. I was listed as the responsible party. When they were 2 months late on rent 18 months later, the property manager called me. Not them. Me. When I was 28, my sister's car needed a transmission. $2,200. I paid $1,400 of it. Diane told me she'd pay me back in installments. I have received 0 installments. It has been 5 years. The rule in our house was, "We don't talk about money at this table." My father said it at every holiday. He said it in the way that people say things that are actually commands dressed up as customs. What the rule was actually for was making sure that nobody ever had to look at the total. Nobody ever had to sit across from me and add up 17 years of electric bills and co-signed leases and transmission payments and grocery runs and see what the number came to. I know what the number comes to. I'm good at this. For a long time, I told myself it was love. The way you tell yourself a lot of things when the alternative requires you to rebuild what you understand about the people who were supposed to protect you. Margaret Ose had sent me a yellow sticky note tucked inside a copy of my grandfather's original the Friday before the reading. It said, "Page 4, read it before you go in." Margaret was the estate attorney of record. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain that made a small clicking sound when she moved. She had been my grandfather's attorney for 11 years. She had called me 3 weeks after he died, not to discuss business, but to tell me that my grandfather had spoken about me regularly, and with something in his voice she described as a specific kind of proud. I had not cried in front of anyone since I was 22. I cried in the parking garage of my office building with my engine running. I had already read page 4. I had read the entire will twice, the original and what had been filed with the court as the current version. I knew what page 4 said in the original. I knew what page 4 said in the version my father believed we were all gathered to execute. The difference between those 2 pages was $112,000 and a lake house in Hocking Hills. 9 days before the reading, I had filed a petition with the Franklin County Probate Court to authenticate and admit the original will. I had submitted a certified copy authenticated by Margaret's firm. I had noted, formally, in legal language, in a document with a case number, the discrepancies between the filed version and the executed original, including a notary stamp dated 14 months before my grandfather had even met the notary in question. I had done all of that, and I still went. I went because of a photograph, not a recent one, a photograph from 1988. My father was 24 in it. He was standing in a field somewhere in Hardin County, squinting into the sun, and he was laughing, not performing a laugh, not making a point with a laugh, but actually laughing with his whole chest at something outside the frame. I had never seen him look like that in real life. I wanted to go and see if any version of that person was still in the room. I wrote one rule for myself that morning on a post-it note I stuck to the inside cover of my work bag. Do not sign anything you have not read completely. I carried the blue fountain pen in my coat pocket. The conference room at Whitmore and Hale smells like the leather of the chairs and something floral, a diffuser on the credenza that nobody ever thinks about. The carpet is a muted blue-green that probably had a specific name in a catalog from 2009. The overhead lights are slightly too warm. I arrived 4 minutes early. The room was already half full. My father sat at the head of the table in the Carhartt vest he had worn to every significant occasion since I could remember: my college graduation, my grandfather's funeral, and apparently a will reading. He was talking to my sister Diane, who was tapping her acrylic nails on the table in a rhythm that would have driven anyone nearby to madness. My mother sat to his left with a dish towel she'd brought from home folded over her left shoulder. She was looking at her phone. She didn't look up when I walked in. I counted the chairs. 11. Enough for family on both sides. I noted what was missing. My grandfather's neighbor Carl, who had been specifically mentioned in an earlier draft as a witness, was not there. The associate from Margaret's firm who had witnessed the original signing was not there. Margaret was there, at the far end, glasses on her chain, a legal pad in front of her with handwriting I couldn't read from where I was standing. Margaret looked at me when I walked in. She did not smile. She gave me one slow nod, the kind that carries a full sentence in it. I sat down 2 chairs from my father. He looked at me the way he always does, assessing, calculating, deciding in the first half-second whether I was going to be useful or inconvenient. I placed my coat on the back of my chair. The blue pen was in my pocket. I folded my hands on the table and let my face do nothing. My father opened before Margaret did. He welcomed everyone. He talked about my grandfather in a way that was technically accurate and completely hollow: dates, accomplishments, A story about a fishing trip that I knew he had heard secondhand because my grandfather told me about that trip, and my father wasn't there. Diane nodded along with her eyes slightly too wide, the way she does when she's performing an emotion she hasn't actually located yet. My mother kept the dish towel on her shoulder and looked at a point just past my father's head. Then my father said that before they began the formal reading, he wanted to make sure everyone understood the document they'd be reviewing. He said my grandfather had made some adjustments, his word, adjustments, in the final months of his life. He said this with the careful tone of someone who has practiced the sentence. Diane jumped in. She said it would be simple and quick, her phrase, and that everyone would leave with clarity. She said the word clarity the way people say it when they mean compliance. My mother said nothing. I asked Margaret if I could see the version of the document that had been filed with the court. My father answered before Margaret could. He said the copy in front of everyone was the current, executed document. He said that was the one they'd be reading today. I said, I'd like to see the filed version. Margaret said she had copies for everyone and began distributing them. My father's jaw moved in a small, controlled way. While Margaret distributed the copies, something happened at the table that I noticed and no one else did. Diane reached for her water glass, and her hand was not completely steady. Not a tremor, just a small excess of intention in the movement. She was thinking about what to do with her hands, and it showed. Margaret slid a folder across the table to me and pressed her fingertips on top of it for just a half-second before releasing it. It was such a small thing. Warm, plain, no performance. I opened the folder. The document my father had asked everyone to sign was 11 pages. Page 4 of his version read, "To my granddaughter Nora Ann Callahan, I leave the sum of $0, and no property, having otherwise provided for her during my lifetime." The sentence was grammatically correct. The margin spacing was consistent. The font was the same. The page number was in the right place. And the notary stamp in the bottom right corner of page 4 was dated March 14, 2021. My grandfather did not meet the notary, a man named Douglas Fair who operated out of a UPS store in Delaware, Ohio, until August of 2022. I knew this because I had already pulled Douglas Fair's notary commission records from the Ohio Secretary of State's office and cross-referenced them against my grandfather's calendar, which Margaret had provided to me as part of the estate file. A notary stamp dated 17 months before the notary ever encountered the signatory is not a clerical error. It is a fabrication. In Ohio, it is also a degree felony. I read this the way I read everything at work, not with anger, just with the specific calm that comes from recognizing a pattern you have seen before. Not surprised, just confirming. I placed the document back in the folder exactly as I had found it. I excused myself to use the restroom. The hallway outside the conference room had a window at the far end that looked out over 3rd Street. I stood there for a moment. The afternoon light was flat and gray-white, the kind Columbus gets in November that isn't quite rain and isn't quite cloud cover, just a uniform suspension of brightness without warmth. I looked at the glass. I thought about my grandfather pressing a fountain pen into both of my hands and saying, "Don't let that be the last thing you are." I thought about a pink electric bill on a kitchen counter when I was 16. The decision had already been made 9 days ago. Standing at that window, I just acknowledged it. I dried my hands. I walked back in. If you have ever been handed a document and told to sign it before you finished reading, tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and if you're new here, hit subscribe. You're going to want to be here for the rest of this. I sat back down. My expression had not changed. My father was watching me. He slid the document in front of me and placed my grandfather's blue fountain pen in my hand. He said, "Sign it. You get nothing anyway." I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at Margaret. I said, "Margaret, would you like to tell them, or should I?" Margaret said, "I'll read from page 4 of the authenticated original." Before she opened her folder, I looked down the table at Diane and said, "I did something for Margaret's office last Tuesday, reviewed some case notes on the authenticated filing. She sends her thanks." Diane looked at me without understanding. Margaret gave a small, genuine nod. Then Margaret opened her folder. I set the pen down on the table, parallel to the edge. I did not uncap it. The room did not know the meal was already over. There is a specific quality to a room right before the shape of everything in it changes. Margaret was reading from her folder. My father was still wearing the expression of a man who believes he is in charge of what is about to happen. Diane had stopped tapping her nails. My mother had put down her phone. I was the only person at that table who knew what page 4 of the authenticated original said. I thought about the pen in my coat pocket. The first time I had held it was the day of my graduation, in a parking lot outside the Ohio State Law Building, and I had felt the weight of it, a real weight, heavier than you'd expect, and thought that my grandfather had carried this thing for 50 years, and it still worked, and that meant something about taking care of what matters. I thought about the lake at Hocking Hills, the sound of it in early morning. Share this with someone who knows exactly what these next 10 minutes feel like. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in that room. I read everyone. Margaret read from the authenticated original will, case number filed 9 days prior in Franklin County Probate Court. Page 4, authenticated version. To my granddaughter, Nora Ann Callahan, I leave the sum of $112,000. $112,000. And the property at 4 Lakeview Road, Hocking Hills, Ohio, in full and without condition, because she is the only one who ever asked me what I needed before asking me what I had. The room did not erupt. It went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the floor shifts under everyone's feet at once and nobody wants to be the first to move. I watched my father's face. He was very still. The smirk, the one that had been sitting on his face since I walked in, did not so much disappear as deflate. Something left it, not confidence. Whatever he had been using confidence to cover. Diane looked at my father. My father did not look back at her. My mother looked at the dish towel on her shoulder as if she had forgotten it was there. Margaret continued reading. The petition to authenticate had been accepted by the court. The forged page 4 had been flagged for review. Douglas Fayer, the notary, had already been contacted by the court administrator. She said this without editorial. She said it the way I would have said it, in the tone of someone describing what the paperwork says, not what it means. 3 pale faces. My mother's was not pale. My mother looked, and I have thought about this many times since, she looked relieved. Like something she had been bracing for had finally landed. I did not smile. I watched it the way I watch a balance sheet correct itself, with a kind of professional quiet that is not satisfaction exactly, but is the recognition that the numbers are now, finally, accurate. I began to gather my things. My father said my name, not Nora, my full name, the way he said it when I was a child and had done something he wanted to address formally. I looked at him. He said, "You had no right to file anything." I said, "I had every legal right. The petition is already accepted." He said, and his voice had changed registers, gone lower and tighter, the way voices go when the performance drops and something realer comes through, that I had humiliated this family in front of an attorney. I said, "The humiliation was already in the document, Dad." Then I said, "I will still help you with your estate planning, on my terms, whenever you're ready." He didn't answer. He was looking at the table, and in that silence I saw something. I don't know how else to describe it. His hands were flat on the table, and he was looking at a point between his knuckles, and he looked, for just 1 second, like a 23-year-old, standing in a county clerk's office in jeans with a hole in the knee, watching someone stamp a document that erased him. He had spent 40 years making sure that never happened again. He had just done the same thing to his own daughter that had been done to him. He didn't know how to see that, but I could. It didn't change anything. It didn't need to. I wasn't there to change anything. I was there to make sure the document said what it was supposed to say. I picked up the blue fountain pen from the table, capped, unused. I put it in my coat pocket. I did not look back at the table. I sat in my car in the parking garage on 3rd Street with the engine off, and the window cracked 2 inches. November air. The smell of concrete and exhaust, and faintly, underneath it, something almost like rain. I held the pen. When I had walked into that building, it was a tribute. A quiet way of bringing my grandfather into a room I was nervous about. When my father had pressed it into my hand to sign, to erase myself from what my grandfather left me, It had felt like something being taken. Not just the pen, the gesture it carried. Now it was just a pen again. A good one, heavy for its size, that still worked after 50 years because someone had taken care of it. I looked at it for a moment, and then I put it in my coat pocket against my chest. I opened my phone. I left the family group chat. I did not write anything first. I blocked my sister's number, not in anger, in the way you close a tab you're done reading. I sent a single text to Margaret. "Thank you for the sticky note." She responded in 40 seconds with a single period. I drove home on 270 South with the radio off. It was not the silence I had driven there in. That one had been held together by tension, by the bracing for what was coming. This silence had nothing in it that needed to be managed. It was just quiet. The ordinary quiet of a drive home, which is one of the better kinds of quiet there is. My mother called 6 days later. She called at 7:14 in the morning, which is when she has always been awake, and which meant she had been thinking about it since at least the night before. She did not open with an apology. She opened with, "I want you to know, I didn't know what was in the document." I said, "Okay." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I should have asked." That is the closest she has come to naming what she did. I wrote it down afterward, not to use against her, but because I wanted to have an accurate record. My father did not call. Diane sent a text 2 weeks later that said, "This isn't over." I did not respond. It has been over for some time. The Franklin County Probate Court's review of the forged page was concluded. The notary, Douglas Fair, surrendered his commission. The matter was referred to the prosecutor's office. I do not know what happened after that referral. I do know that my father hired an attorney, which is a thing he has never done before, and which I am sure is an uncomfortable experience for a man who thought that being in a room with documents meant being in charge of them. The lake house at Hocking Hills was transferred to my name in December. Margaret's firm handled the paperwork. I drove out there on a Saturday in January, the kind of January day that is gray and cold and still, with ice at the edges of the pond. I stood on the back porch and listened. 2 weeks after the transfer, my mother drove out with a casserole dish. She set it on the counter. She looked around the kitchen. She said, "He loved this place." I said, "I know." She was not asking for forgiveness. She wasn't ready for that yet. She was doing something smaller. She was showing up. I don't know if that leads anywhere. But I let her put the casserole in the refrigerator, and I made coffee, and we sat at the table for 40 minutes and talked about my grandfather's ducks and what their names had been, and neither of us cried, which felt like a kind of honesty. It is the following September. I am on the back porch of the lake house at Hocking Hills on a Saturday morning. The water is low for September. It was a dry summer. The ducks my grandfather named are gone. There are new ones, 3 of them that have started coming since May. I have not named them yet. I might. My mother is inside. She has been driving out on the first Saturday of the month since March. She brings something each time, a dish, a plant she divided from her own garden, once a framed photograph from 1988 of my father laughing in a field with his whole chest. She set it on the mantel above the fireplace. I left it there. The blue pen is on the desk inside, in a drawer. I use it for things that matter, for documents that need my signature in a way I've actually decided to give it. I used it to sign the property transfer in December. I used it last week to sign a new client agreement for a woman in Gahanna who is navigating her own estate and whose family is, as she put it, not making it easy. I told her that was the most common situation I worked with. I told her I would read everything. I think about what my grandfather said. Don't let that be the last thing you are. I think he meant don't let being first be your whole identity. Don't let it be the thing you carry alone as proof that you're worthy of a place at the table. He left me something so that I would know I already had a place at the table. Not because I paid